Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another Learning Lunch. This one is co-hosted by Format Approved and eGestalt Technologies. Today's presentation is titled The HIPAA Security Risk Analysis, Pros and Cons of Self-Assessment Tools versus Expert HIPAA Guidance. Some brief introductions before we begin. We're joined today by Anupam Sahai. Anupam is the co-founder and the president of eGestalt Technologies. He's a recognized expert in the areas of healthcare IT, cloud computing, security and compliance, and networking. Thank you so much for being with us today, Anupam.
My pleasure. Thank you for the session.
And my name is Brian Johnson. I'm sort of moderating this session with Anupam. I'll also be discussing some of the subject matter. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved. I have extensive experience with HIPAA and compliance training and have participated in a number of risk analysis. So before we move on, let's look at our questions while I go over some housekeeping notes. You can review the questions we'll address for today's session while I go over these. You can ask questions of us at any time during today's session by entering them into the chat area. At the end of our session, we'll address as many questions as time allows. So you can ask questions of us at any time, and we'll save those for the end and then get to as many as time allows. If we run out of time, we'll address those questions in written form after the session. Please note that all registered attendees of today's session will receive an email with links to both the slides and the recorded version of this event. So we always get questions from our attendees about whether they can see the slides after the event. Rest assured, we'll send those out along with a number of other resources for you. So watch your email inbox for the slides and the video recording. All right, well, let's go ahead and get to our subject matter today. So our first question is, why is the security risk analysis important? And I think I'll start to answer that question, and then maybe Anupam can hop in if he has something to add here. So first of all, the security risk analysis is the very first requirement of the HIPAA security rule. So it's sort of the HIPAA 101, the first requirement. And failure to conduct a risk analysis could result in severe breach consequences. So what this means is, for one thing, you have to do it for compliance. You have to do the risk analysis to meet the government requirements, and that's true for both HIPAA and for meaningful use, which we'll talk about more here in a moment. But also doing it actually serves an important purpose in that you really need this risk analysis to prevent breaches. So government enforcement is one issue, but beyond government enforcement, a breach in itself causes all sorts of problems with liability. So as you can see on the slide here, the average cost of a breach is about $5.5 million. There's different estimates. I've seen 6.5. But most of that cost is not actually from government fines, although those are considerable, or they can be. The cost actually comes from liability. So when you expose patient data through a breach, the civil liability is quite consequential. And the security rule is your best weapon for preventing that. Why is that the case? Well, the security risk analysis basically provides a map for identifying the security gaps and vulnerabilities that you have. And it also provides detailed remediation guidance. So the idea here is that the risk analysis does a survey of your compliance environment. It's going to look at various aspects of, where is your protected health information housed? Do you have access controls? Are you meeting those requirements? And then if you're not, it provides guidance on what you need to do to be compliant. So doing all of those things, if you go through a risk analysis and perform the remediation, then you can rest assured that you're protected from breach. And so then you won't have any breach that you have to report to the government, and you won't have those liability issues. One other thing I should mention is that as part of that risk analysis, it's going to look at your current documentation. So you need up-to-date HIPAA policies and procedures. Those need to cover various things. That some of them are things that people often don't think about, like, do you have a recovery plan if there were to be a disaster, for example. It also is going to look at whether your staff are getting HIPAA training, because HIPAA requires that all staff members who come into contact with PHI get training on a regular basis so that they understand their HIPAA obligations. So there's a number of different things that are assessed in the risk analysis, and those are some of the highlights of it. But going through that process and remediating any gaps that are identified is really the cornerstone of compliance. Would you like to add anything to that, Anupam?
Yeah, so, excuse me, as you said, besides being a requirement that comes from the HIPAA omnibus regulation or for getting the meaningful use dollars through attestation, security risk analysis is essentially giving you a high-level risk exposure score, as it were. It tells you how easy is it for cyber attackers to break in and steal the PHI information. And so you want to be able to do risk analysis so that you are understanding where you stand today and then take steps to security harden your practice or your medical business. And to give you some estimates, there are about 25 to 30 million identities that are breached every year. And roughly about 1 to 12 million identities are stolen per month. So this is a very pervasive problem. If you're not taking steps to understand where your security posture is today and taking steps to fix it, then you are exposed potentially and open to being breached, and thereby your security posture can be compromised. So I just want to reinforce that this is a very important step towards ensuring compliance and to ensure protection of your IT assets or any strategic assets.
Absolutely. And again, you know, the government regulations are one thing, but I think there's a growing awareness in healthcare that the real issue here is the exposure that you have from a civil liability perspective. So that's where more of the costs actually come in. Well, we mentioned this a moment ago, but let's reinforce this as well. Most providers are participating in the meaningful use programs, and the risk analysis is a core objective of the EHR meaningful use programs. So this was originally referred to as Core Measure 15. They've truncated the measures some in the 2014 versions. So you actually could call it Core 14 now if you want, but either way, the requirement is that you conduct a security risk analysis in accordance with the requirements under this federal regulation, which essentially means under HIPAA. And the reason why this is important is that you can't attest for meaningful use if you haven't conducted that security risk analysis and if you haven't done the remediation that it finds to be necessary. So many of you may be aware that there's actually a very aggressive audit program for the meaningful use program. So if you're participating, if you're getting those incentive payments, the government has a goal of auditing about 10% of everyone who attests. That's a very high audit rate, and part of how they've accomplished this is by using third-party contractors essentially to go out and conduct these audits. We've heard from people who are intimately involved in these audits that the number one reason why people fail them is because they either didn't conduct a risk analysis and said that they did, or they conducted a risk analysis that wasn't adequate, or perhaps they didn't complete the remediation. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about, you know, what is a risk analysis. Some people seem to think that just plugging in a certified EHR means that you've taken care of your security issues, and that couldn't be further from the case. So if you're participating in that program, there is a very real danger of government audit, and if you were to be audited and they found that you didn't actually conduct the risk analysis, the least bad thing that could happen is that you would have to return those incentive payments, and each year that you said you completed the risk analysis and actually hadn't done one properly, you would have to give back all of that money. You could actually be exposed to greater penalties than that. If they found, you know, that you willfully misrepresented what you'd done, you could be open to various fraud charges as the worst case scenario. So if you participate in those programs, it's essential that you conduct the security risk analysis. It's required by HIPAA either way, but you're certainly more exposed if you do participate in the MU program. And what you need to cover is a little bit different. Maybe you could address some of that and other issues involved, Anupam.
Yeah, so you talked about the willful neglect, which is that if you have taken the meaningful use dollars from the government, which is part of the federal incentive program, and you haven't done a risk analysis, as you said, Brian, that's willful neglect and misrepresentation. And there have been some incidents where, you know, CIOs have not only been heavily fined, and the fines are up to $1.5 million per incident. but you're also liable for criminal prosecution. And by the way, that's one of the few of the CIOs who've done that have undergone criminal prosecution as well. But the purpose here is that it's not worth the risk. It's not worth the risk. It's a requirement coming from the government, and there are ways of doing security risk analysis that we will talk about. The other myth is that EHR vendors take care of that, and the short answer is no, they do not. And to do security risk analysis, as you see in the next few slides, you have to look at the entire business. You have to look at the entire infrastructure to determine your risk exposure. So it's a critical step in your process to get HIPAA Omnibus compliant.
It's bigger than the EHR, and it kind of amuses me that people sometimes think that the vendor will take care of it because, you know, in conversations I have with people in the industry, the vendors are very focused on implementing their, you know, their solution. They're not going to go out of their way to do extra things for you. I mean, some of them will. There's great companies out there, but HIPAA is not their responsibility. It's really the provider's responsibility. So let's take a look at what is involved in a security risk analysis. And Anupam, I think you're the best one to address this question. Walk us through some of the steps if you could.
Sure. So in the next few slides, we will talk about what does it take to do security risk analysis. So let's start at a high level. At a high level, what we're trying to do is three big steps. One is the evaluation and assessment step. And that is really the stage where we identify all the critical assets that are important to the business. So from a medical business perspective, these are assets that are either storing PHI or assets that are used to view PHI information, like a client workstation or a nurse station, or these are assets that are used to transmit PHI information, like firewalls and other assets. So firstly, we evaluate all the assets, identify them, and then the next step is to understand what are the threats and vulnerabilities that pose a risk to these assets. That's the second stage, risk assessment. And once the risk evaluation is done through these two steps, the next step is to fix the problems that are found. So typically in a risk assessment process, you're looking at critical assets, you're looking at threats, vulnerabilities, and if hackers or malicious insiders compromise these assets, what's the impact to the business in terms of losses, in terms of liabilities, and the likelihood of this happening. So all of these are taken together to come up with a risk score that is a measure of the risk exposure that businesses have. So these are the high-level steps that are required, and in the next slide we'll show you exactly how to go about doing this in a staged manner.
All right, well, let's take a look at that then. Continue on if you could. What are the steps then, breaking it down a little further, that are required to do this?
Yeah, so first step is, as I said, step one is to identify all the PHI assets that are critical to the company that need to be protected, because at the end of the day, the biggest scope for HIPAA Omnibus is to ensure privacy and security of PHI information. So any asset that is dealing with PHI needs to be identified. And for those assets, steps 2 and 3 are looking at potential threats and vulnerabilities that might be acting upon those assets, that might pose a risk to those assets. So example of threats could be an external cybersecurity hacker or malicious insider. A vulnerability for a particular asset could be maybe a default password setting that hasn't been changed and anybody can exercise and get in. There could be malware. There could be misconfiguration of firewalls. You might have the server in a server room, but access to the server room is not authenticated. There's no access control to access the resources. So there are a number of processes and technical safeguards required to ensure that the threats and vulnerabilities do not pose a risk exposure or pose a risk to the PHI assets being compromised. And that's really measured in step 4. So what are the safeguards in place, And if there are safeguards that prevent these threats and vulnerabilities from acting upon these assets, then you're good. Otherwise, there is a risk exposure. And finally, 5 and 6 steps talks about how big an impact will it cause in terms of if the asset gets compromised. And the likelihood of that particular threat happening is also taken into account. And at the end of the day, after all of this is done, you are coming up with a risk score, a risk determination, which tells you what's the risk exposure. And once the gaps are known for risk, then the next step is to provide remediation or fixes, which are essentially a set of controls recommendation to prevent these assets from being compromised. So these are the set of steps that are required to evaluate and identify the risk exposure for a particular business which is dealing with these variables.
So obviously, to add to that, Anupam, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of expertise involved in this, because you need to be able to determine, if you look at steps 5 and 6, for example, the likelihood of a threat occurrence. So you've identified a vulnerability and a threat. What is the likelihood of it occurring? And then there's a whole different axis here, which is if this does occur, what is the potential impact of it? So there's a lot of nuance here involved in making these determinations.
That is very much correct, yeah.
So part of every security risk analysis is going to be a HIPAA compliance assessment. Why is that the case? Could you address that for us, Anupam?
Yeah, so HIPAA risk analysis involves looking at all the variables that I talked about, which is you're trying to identify all the PHI assets and the threats and vulnerabilities that are being exposed. These assets are being exposed to these threats and vulnerabilities. And these assets could be IT assets, it could be servers, it could be Windows workstations, it could be firewalls, or these assets could be processes, like you need to have policies and procedures in place to ensure that only the right people are able to access the PHI asset. So there are process-related guidelines to ensure that you are safeguarding the PHI assets, and there are IT-related guidelines to ensure that the PHI assets are safeguarded. So to do risk analysis, it's a combination of both manual assessment plus automated scanning for vulnerabilities. And the manual assessment process, again, can be automated, as you'll see in the later slides, but it involves a combination of automated scanning and some task list-oriented assessment, which pertains to policies, guidelines, questions being asked about where does PHI reside, how is it accessed, and so there is some need for human intervention to answer these questions, which an automated system cannot determine on their own. Whatever it can be automated is there are tools that we'll talk about that help you get there, but it involves some degree of human intervention, and so the complete way of doing risk analysis is therefore a combination of assessment plus scanning to complete the whole cycle of understanding and determining your risk exposure.
And just to add to that, people don't often realize that about half, or it's more than half, of the requirements of the security rule concern administrative matters. So that's really where this assessment process comes in. There's a lot of IT aspects involved as well, but there's a lot of questions around, policies and procedures, termination procedures, things like that, that really no machine could answer, and that's part of what we're getting at here with the assessment. So when we're looking at what tools are available for self-assessment, there's a variety of them out there. Some of them are paid, some of them are free services. The example we thought we'd deal with for the most part today is that HHS has released a free tool that practices can download for self-assessment. It's for the security rule only, so it's limited in what it touches, and we're going to talk about sort of the advantages and disadvantages of this tool as we go forward. So these tools really are only suited for the smallest practices, and they only cover certain aspects of what is required for a risk analysis. So I think in talking about these, that's sort of the first thing that we need to understand, is that these can help automate some of the assessment aspects of the risk analysis. They don't address many of the other aspects that we have been talking about and that we're going to continue to talk about. But they have released this tool that you can download, and it will sort of run you through some of the questions that need to be asked to make that assessment of your current security environment. Why do many providers struggle with an unguided self-assessment? We've been getting a lot of feedback from providers about this process. There's a couple different reasons why this can be difficult. One is that sometimes people have technical difficulties with it. So it's actually a fairly decent piece of technology to their credit. This is, something from CMS. But anytime you're dealing with technology like this, there can always be technical difficulties. The issue, of course, is that there's no customer support provided with it. So if you run into technical difficulties, you're kind of stuck on your own. I think a more pressing issue here is that these are basically taken from the NIST guidelines. The NIST sort of provides guidance on how to actually go about doing the assessment. And so it uses a lot of specialized jargon that many providers are not going to understand. So it's going to ask about access controls, a number of technical terms like that I think many providers are not familiar with. Now, it does provide a glossary, which helps some, but it's going to be a lot for providers to wade through. It would take a lot of time to do it, and more to the point, even if if it's the first time you've ever seen this term, access control, and you're trying to make an evaluation of whether or not you've got access controls in place, that really is taking a provider outside of their comfort zone, to say the least. So it requires judgment calls. It requires providers to make evaluations on these answers, and they may not have the expertise to address the question that's asked. Another problem here is that I call this the danger of good enough thinking in self-assessment. And that's that we all, I think it's human nature, want to believe that we're doing a pretty good job at taking care of things. And so, especially if you've got this long, involved assessment that you're trying to go through, I think there's a natural tendency to say, well, I'm going to give myself the benefit of the doubt on this question and say that I'm doing a good enough job on this and say, yes, I've met this requirement. The issue is of course, that if a third party is doing it, if you've got a security specialist doing it, they're not biased in the same way that you'll be biased toward yourself, of course. So when they're answering those questions, or when you're answering those questions with them, they're not going to just say, well, you're probably doing well enough. They're going to make sure that you're actually meeting the requirement. And so all of this speaks to the fact that expertise is required to interpret and implement the HIPAA requirements. Anupam, I know that you've done so many different risk analyses with providers of all types. I'd like you to add to this, if you would, and sort of amplify some of these points.
Yeah, no, I think the HIPAA requirements and the legalese is very ambiguous, and it's important for an expert to be able to understand that and demystify it. So if you take the HIPAA guidelines as it is and try to make sense of it, really it's going to be an uphill task. And that's what we want to say here, is that there are some judgment calls, there's some demystification that is needed, and also there are best practices and implementation guidelines that you need to be aware of to take the HIPAA recommendations, or HIPAA different rules of HIPAA, citations of HIPAA, and make sense out of it. And that needs expertise, that needs domain expertise, that needs security background and the audit background to understand what the requirements are, what the HHS audit protocol is, which is really the requirements coming from HHS as to what they would be looking at to make sure that you pass the audit. So all of these considerations are required when you're going through the assessment process and the auditing process.
And it goes back to the point that really what we're trying to do here is there's some people who kind of take a check the box approach where They really just want to make sure that they're complying with the letter of the law, and so, they just want to do what they have to do. I certainly understand that, and I've never met a doctor who got into healthcare because of HIPAA, that their passion for HIPAA drew them into medicine. But remember that the real danger here is that you'll have a breach and that you'll breach patient data. We've heard that attacks on healthcare providers are up more than 100% since 2010. The FBI just issued an industry advisory warning providers that they have the most valuable data to people who want to do identity theft, and yet they lag badly behind other industries in protecting that data. So if you want to have real protection of the data, it's not enough just to sort of go through the process, go through the motions of it. You want to really be protecting that data. So what does a self-assessment report look like? And this little image here on the right is taken from the HHS tool. And this sort of, I think, beautifully illustrates the difficulty of using the tool. The issue is that I went through and answered yes to every question. None of the questions that I answered yes to are actually true because I'm not a healthcare provider. So it's just relying on whatever you tell it. And then interpreting the results is very difficult. So these citations you're seeing, it's great that they give you the citations, but unfortunately, that's about all the guidance that you're going to get out of this report. There is a risk level you can see there. But, those citations are not useful information for the vast majority of people who don't read these regulations. So when you get this report out at the end of the process, you do get some pie charts that are labeled, but they don't tell you very much. And you get a report like this that identifies questions and how you answered them. But these are very difficult results to understand. There's no written summary. There's no executive summary of any kind. So you just kind of get this table that shows how you answered the questions. There's no remediation guidance whatsoever. So if you come out of this process and you've got these answers that show, you've got this vulnerability, what exactly you're supposed to do with that information, there's no guidance on that at all. There's no information about how you should close a vulnerability. There's no information about how to institute new policies or anything of that sort. You really need out of this is useful information to be sure, but you really need another tool to take that information and generate a report that you can actually use. Anupam, would you like to add to that?
No, I think the key here is that this information presented is cryptic, it's incomplete, and it's at best more of an informational tool that allows you to understand what the requirements are from a citation level, but doesn't help you in completing the process.
Right. It certainly gives you a sense of the questions you need to be able to answer, but it doesn't help you in terms of taking the next step to close those gaps.
Right.
What are some other things that are missing from these sorts of self-assessment tools? I think you're probably the best person to address that, Anupam.
Sure. So as I said earlier, the first step in doing a risk analysis is to find out all the critical assets that are available in the infrastructure that are called PHI critical assets. And that involves a combination of network scanning. It involves some manual processes which are critical to safeguarding the PHI information. So typically the HHS tool, for example, does not support network scanning. So you cannot determine the vulnerabilities, and without knowing the vulnerabilities, you have no way of knowing what are the threats that can compromise those assets. So that's a critical missing piece that is required for security risk analysis. The other step that is missing from typically these some of the free commercial of the self-based tools is that there is no detailed gap and remediation reports. So the HHS tool talks about just the security rule, as Brian was saying earlier, but that's not sufficient to be HIPAA compliant. You need to know about the privacy rule. There are administrative safeguards. There are multiple rules and sections of rules that need to be completed or complied with so that one can be HIPAA compliant. And as a medical business, you need to know where you stand today from the HIPAA requirements perspective, which is essentially covered in the HIPAA gap report. And then the remediation report will tell you what are the steps you need to take to plug the gaps or to remediate all the gaps that are found. So getting a complete global view of all your HIPAA requirements, gaps, and remediation is important. And those are required to completely complete out the meaningful use report requirements. So it's important that the whole HIPAA regulation set and the vulnerabilities and threats be assessed so that you can do and complete the security risk analysis. And then things change. So continuous monitoring is an important aspect of maintaining your compliance posture. It's not sufficient that you be compliant in a point in time and then as new employees join or new assets come in, new laptops come in, or new some IT infrastructure changes that you can easily get out of compliance. So it's important to assess your compliance posture, fix the gaps that are found, and then to maintain your compliance posture through continuous monitoring. Because as I always say, security and compliance is a journey. And it's important to take the first step in that journey, but you need to travel that road to maintain your compliance posture. And then the other outcome of one of the other shortcomings of this HHS tool is that it's meant for very small practices which have single users and single location. As I said earlier, it's incomplete, but it's not applicable at all for any larger practices beyond 1 or 2 physician offices. And that too, even for the smaller practices, it doesn't cover all the requirements.
Yeah, so if you're in a larger environment or a practice that has more than one location, you're kind of dead in the water with this tool, incomplete as it is. So how is an expert-guided risk analysis different? Anupam, please address this for us. I think we've touched on some of this, but let's go into it in more depth.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, HIPAA has multiple citations which can be addressed through a combination of an automated security scanning tool and through a process of answering some questions about policies, procedures, and people and how they play into the whole process of ensuring privacy and security of PHI. So the first thing is to make sure that the whole process is complete, that it meets the HHS requirements, the audit protocol requirements. And the audit protocol requirements from HHS essentially lays down very clearly what are the different things that they would look for in case a business is audited. So they basically are going to look at whether you've done a security risk analysis. They'll look at the privacy and security rule related gaps and what have you done to ensure completeness of the implementation. And then they'll look at the overall HIPAA compliance or lack thereof. So ensuring that you're able to understand HIPAA jargon, understand all the requirements and the best practices required to ensure that you have taken the steps to demystify HIPAA and implement the requirements so that any ambiguities that might exist have been resolved. And this needs, as I said, expert guidance. It needs experience to walk you through the process and answer any questions that you might have. And then at the end of the day, the report or the result of the process should be complete, and the report should have all the requirements to meet the HHS protocol requirements so that you can claim to be HIPAA compliant and also attest for meaningful use to get the federal grant dollars. And so there are a number of things in HIPAA, for example, which might be very hard. I'll give you some examples here. For example, there are log auditing requirements, there are security monitoring requirements, there's availability of EPHI. It's very cryptic, and it's better understood through the combination of an automated tool and expert guidance.
So out of this process that is guided by an expert, and what Anupam was just addressing, this combination of human interaction with a powerful automated tool, the report that comes out of that is a very different product than what comes out of a self-assessment tool. So I think Anupam's done a great job of addressing how the self-assessment tool doesn't address all of the HIPAA requirements. And it doesn't address everything that you need to do for meaningful use. So an expert report is going to be complete in a way that the self-assessment isn't. But there's a lot of other aspects to it that are also an improvement that I think you can guess at from what we've already been discussing. So for example, it includes an executive summary that will explain in basic human language what it is that the report has found and give the provider a sense of what they need to do to address the problems that were identified. So it comes back to this notion that you have to be an expert sometimes to put things in simple language, and a report from an expert is going to do that for you, or at least it should. It's going to provide much more detailed results as well, with narrative explanations of what's involved and access to additional resources such as links that can take you to more information or patches for IT problems, that sort of thing, which leads into the last bullet on our slide here, that it's going to give you that remediation guidance, which is really ultimately the whole point of all of this. So the provider will be able to address the problems that are found, not just identify them and have perhaps an incomplete understanding of what those problems are, but an expert report is going to give you information on what you need to do to fix it. And that's really what all of this is about. Anupam, would you like to add to that?
No, I think you said it, and I think we'll cover some of this in the next few slides in terms of what else can be done from a tool intelligence perspective.
All right, well, let's look at that then. So how can tools built by experts then provide additional guidance, since that's what we were just addressing anyway? Anupam, you should take this one.
Okay. So, we talked about what is missing from the current set of tools, but the ideal tool that we're looking for, and we have the tool that we'll talk a little bit more about, should provide and meet all the requirements of HIPAA. It should also have a knowledge base that demystifies all the HIPAA jargons and tells you very clearly what the requirements are. It should tell you all the best practices and implementation guidance needed to implement the HIPAA controls, and should generate detailed gap reports and remediation reports with complete guidance on how to fix the problems that are found. And of course, it should have the required policy documents, the training documents and the training guidance in terms of what are the policies that need to be in place for a business to be HIPAA compliant, what kind of workforce training and other kinds of training that you need to make sure that you're staying on top of all the HIPAA requirements. And then this should be a continuous monitoring tool that allows you not only access to your current compliance posture, but also gives you changes as they happen. And of course, the risk analysis should be included in this overall process through a process of automation and the manual assessment that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, just to add to that, so what you're really looking for, the ideal here is to have a tool where everything is sort of brought together. And so if you've got a tool where you can have access to the policies you need and then update them and keep them dynamically updated, that gives you a big advantage over just having, we've heard many times people who have policies dating from 2006 that are kind of kept in a plastic binder somewhere and never looked at. When it comes to an audit, if those policies are badly out of date and they're not actually followed by the practice, it's really not doing you any good. You want to have access to training. You want to have all of those things that you need to actually be compliant and to keep your data secure. You want that in one tool to keep it organized and to actually implement those things. So Anupam, I was hoping you could go through this for us too. Give us an idea of how a tool like this can work in practical terms.
That's right. So this is the Agify tool from eGestalt. and it essentially has been designed from the ground up to deal with HIPAA compliance requirements. And it not only does it initially from an assessment point of view, but it allows you to maintain your compliance through continuous monitoring. So if you start from the top, the first step in any assessment process is to baseline your security, compliance, and risk posture. And once you know where do you stand today, what the gaps are, and what the risk exposure is, then the next step is to do the remediation, which is the green block on the right. The remediation plan essentially tells you all the gaps that are found, how important or unimportant they are, and how to go about fixing the problems that are found. And that involves maybe putting together some policies, new contracts. It might involve putting together new best practices and other implementation guidance needed to fix the problems that are found. There might be new training requirements, which is part of HIPAA remediation as well. So all of this is brought together in the tool, and you will have access to this through the automation tool. And once you fix all the gaps, then you can essentially become compliant and have a minimal risk exposure or zero risk exposure, depending on where do you stand today. But not only this, you can repeat this process. You can schedule these assessments, schedule the scans through this automation tool, so that the heavy lifting from a business side, from the customer side, is very minimal. Anything that can be automated is completely automated, and at any point in time, you will have access to a real-time dashboard that gives you your compliance posture. It tells you your risk exposure, and how, if things change, that will be reflected on the real-time dashboard. Not only that, you can take output in the form of reports, such as a meaningful use report that you can submit to the government for getting the federal grant dollars. You can do risk analysis reports and compliance reports. So in short, this is an automated tool built for HIPAA compliance and for continuous HIPAA compliance monitoring that serves the requirements of HHS and also gives you the freedom and the flexibility to make everything automated with a real-time view. Right?
So let's look then at the possibilities for other tools that are out there. And I know that eGestalt has built a freemium tool that provides a partial network scan and risk analysis. So I think this is interesting, and we've got the URL there. People can look at this. Again, there's no cost associated with this. You can go to www.formedfreescan.com, and you do have to register, but that's it. You then download the agent, which will begin a network scan, and you have access to at least part of the assessment involved in a risk analysis. So Anupam, could you tell us more about what this tool will do for people? I know that it will give them at least some sense of their network vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so this is a free edition of the tool that I just talked about that's available for you to try out. It's a diagnostic tool that you can download and install. There will be a scanning agent that gets installed on your workstation, and within 30 minutes it will give you a good view of your current security exposure. You know, what are the vulnerabilities and what's your risk exposure. You can figure that out pretty quickly. So think of this as a diagnostic tool, and you can kick the tires of the whole process, better understand what is your current risk exposure. And then if you like what you see, you can take the next step of getting to a fully compliant paid version.
So we've got plenty of time left for questions from our audience, and we've got a number of questions. But if you've been holding your questions, please go ahead and ask them now. We're also going to provide some contact information if you'd like to ask us any questions. I'd probably be best for training questions around HIPAA. Anupam is a great HIPAA expert who can answer any questions about HIPAA that you may have. So I'll provide those in a moment. While we go through these questions, you can look at these resources on your screen. Certainly visit egestalt.com to learn more about that tool. Format approved your host here. Obviously, we have free resources that we provide in terms of blogs on HIPAA and other HIT topics along with our training. So do check out that resource. If you'd like the free scan, you can click on the first URL there once we send out the slides, or just go to Format Free Scan. And we also are able to offer a number of eGestalt services through Format Services. So look at those if you get the chance. And in the meantime, we'll go through some of the questions we've gotten from our audience. If we do run out of time, we've got a number of questions here. Rest assured that we'll send out written answers to these questions following the event. The first question is one that I addressed, but just to put your mind at ease, someone's asked if they'll get the slides after the webinar. Of course, we'll send those out to you, so you'll be able to review those at your leisure. You'll also be able to watch a recorded version of this event. So let's see, Anupam, you can see these questions as well. This first question is certainly out of my league technically. Can a risk assessment be carried out on the lines of information security standard? Some of these, I should say, if it's a very technical question, it might be better to answer it in writing, but Anupam, I don't know if you want to address that here, or if it's something better left for later.
No, so the short answer is yes. The risk assessments can be carried out based on the ISO 27K framework as well. Ultimately, all frameworks and risk models address the different variables that I talked about, which is that you're looking at assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and the impact and likelihood factors for a particular business. And whether it's NIST model, which is what we follow, or the ISO 27K model, which is what you're asking about, they have the same set of approach to assessing risk and to determining the risk exposure.
All right, so here's a question from an attendee who would like to know if any users of the eGestalt tool have been through an audit, and if so, what were the results of that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had both the situations where people who are getting audited and had acquired the meaningful use dollars but didn't have the risk analysis in place, and they've come to us and they've approached us in a hurry to say that we need your help to become compliant and do the risk analysis. So that's one scenario that we've addressed, and a number of cases are available. We've also had the situation where people used our tool and got assessed by us, and then they went through an audit and cleared it. So there have been many instances of people getting the meaningful use grant dollars as well. So it's all over the place.
And something to note here is that the eGestalt tool is built really it's built to provide security and compliance, but there's an audit mentality in it. Experts use this language sometimes. So the way that the reports are generated, it refers to the citations that it's satisfying. So when you've got this kind of a report and this kind of tool available, satisfying the terms of an audit is a million times easier, because you can take the auditor and guide them step by step through everything that you've done, and everything that you've done is thoroughly documented, which is absolutely crucial for this. So if you've got this tool in place and you've done what's required to remediate the gaps and everything, you're in great shape when an audit comes along, because you can show in great detail to the auditor what it is you've done to be compliant. All right, let's see. So here's a question. Is there a copy of the output from the full and the free tools that we can look at? Obviously, that's not something I can bring up on the screen right now, but what you get from the free tool, what you get is you're able to log into the portal and get access to kind of a partial version of the eGestalt tool, and Anupam can say more about this in a moment, but it gives you a sense of what your compliance is. So you'll have access to those tools and be able to see the charts that show where your major vulnerabilities are. And so it gives you, that's something that you can do right now if you like, is go to Format Free Scan, try the tool. There's certainly not easy, it's certainly not difficult to implement it and give it a try, and then you'll get a sense of what the output looks like. Anupam, maybe you could say more about that.
Yeah, so the free tool is a diagnostic tool, as I said, with some limited features. It gives you a sense of your current compliance posture, and then the full version, the paid version, has everything that you need to become HIPAA compliant, to do security risk analysis and security scanning. But the free tool is a good way to kick the tires, to get a sense of where you stand today before you decide to jump onto the paid version, if that's the way you want to go.
Okay. Here's someone just asked a question that I think we should address, and it may be a little bit of confusion. They're saying there are 3 tools. What are the differences? I'm not completely sure what they mean by that. The eGasalt tool is an integrated tool, so it really addresses all of your compliance needs in one tool. Maybe you have a sense of what he's getting at there, Anupam? Or is it
I'm
not
not
clear to you?
sure.
Yeah. Maybe he's referring to the URLs on the screen. If you're looking at the second URL, that's to sort of get a look at the different compliance services that are available. I think the best approach for anyone is to do continuous monitoring, to have the network scanning and the risk analysis so that they have complete compliance. But some people prefer an incremental approach. So if you look at that second URL for Formed services, you can get a sense of what the different price points would be for various products. But really, we're really talking about only one tool here. That's the HFI tool, apart, of course, from the HHS tool, which I should have provided a URL for that as well. But if you just do a Google search for, I believe, HHS HIPAA tool will probably bring it up. That's something we can certainly provide in the follow-up. But if you Google it, you'll see it. And I would encourage anyone on this webinar to go give it a shot. Just to see what it's like to do it yourself, because it's certainly not easy to do. Would you like to add anything to that, Anupam?
No, I think you covered it. Thank you.
All right. Here we have a question about the free version of the tool, and it's simply, is the tool something that a provider can install themselves? I'll address that because I have less technical expertise, I think it's safe to say, than Anupam, and I can assure you that it's actually very easy to use. You just go to the site, it's going to basically download it for you. It installs itself for the most part automatically. We can provide you with a walkthrough that sort of, even if you had never touched a computer before, with the walkthrough, you would be able to get through it. But it's very simple. If you've ever downloaded anything off the internet and installed it, I think you'll be comfortable using the tool. And certainly the network scanning aspect of it is something that's done automatically. That's the power of the tool. So it runs in the background. You might notice while it's running that the computer it's on would be a little bit slower. So if you're doing graphics intensive video editing, that is not the computer to do it on. But it's really, it doesn't take very long, and it'll slow your computer down just for a little bit while you're doing it. So you might want to use another computer. But other than that, it's really easy to use, and doesn't take up any of your time or effort for the most part. Anupam, would you like to add to that?
No, I think you said it. It should be very simple to install it, and you should be able to get your compliance posture in a matter of, I would say, 30 to 40 minutes. You'll get a good feel for where you stand today with the free version of the tool.
Now, that's not a complete network scan. It's not what the paid version would give you, but I can tell you that in just 30 minutes of scanning, it's very likely to find a number of issues that you probably need to address as soon as possible. So in just that time, if you do run it for 30 minutes and it says that you've got an incredibly secure network, more power to you. But I have a feeling that most providers are going to get very different results than that. Well, we're very nearly out of time, so I think we should begin our wrap-up. If you do have questions, we didn't get to quite everything. Again, we'll provide written answers to those questions, so you can go ahead and type those out now if you'd like, or do feel free to email either myself, Brian Johnson, or Anupam here, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Again, we're going to assemble your questions and post the answers, not only in the follow-up, but we'll also have a link on the Learning Lunch page that people can click on, because we won't identify who asked the question, but we think it's important to share the answers with everybody so that everybody can benefit from them. And again, one more time, remember that everyone who registered for this event, whether they were able to make it live or not, is going to get both the slides and the video recording of this session. Anupam, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always great to be able to share your expertise.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for setting it up, and thank you all for coming. Appreciate your time, and I know this is a very complicated topic sometimes, so we've tried to demystify it, and hopefully this has been very useful. We would love to hear your feedback.
Remember that you can visit formatapprove.com and click on the Learning Launch button. It's there on the bottom of that screen to learn more about our upcoming events and to register for them. We do these every week. Sometimes we do more than one a week. So our next Learning Lunch is going to air on May 6th, and it's right along the lines of this topic. The title is Encrypting Hard Drives for HIPAA Remediation. So I think there's been a lot of attention paid to encryption lately, and it's something that everyone should do to protect their data. So we'll get some guidance on that. Keep an eye on your email inbox for the follow-up to this session, along with other upcoming Learning Lunch subjects. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.